Our next speaker is Alex Mesoudi, who is a reader in anthropology at Durham University in the UK, where he's part of the Center for Co-Evolution of Biology and Culture. He published a book in 2011 on cultural evolution, how Darwinian theory can explain human culture and synthesize the social sciences.
Yeah, I'm afraid I've changed the title to hopefully reflect as I was writing, I realized that there was probably as much archaeology in the talk as there was psychology, so hopefully this fits better the remit of this fantastic three-day conference that Natalie's put together, looking at interdisciplinary interactions and some kind of evolutionary synthesis within the social sciences to come up with a general theory of cultural evolution. So I'll be talking about human cultural evolution from the Phychology lab to the archaeological record. So I want to start off with really pretty much a point that Mark made, which is this mushroom explosion within human evolution, which is quite an interesting thing about our species, which is we are pretty successful. So in a very relatively short period of time, in evolutionary speaking, we went from a small group of individuals in East Africa, and we pretty rapidly dispersed, migrated around the planet. This gives the numbers of years ago that humans originally moved to different parts of the world, and we successfully moved to and colonized pretty much every terrestrial environment on the planet, and pretty diverse environments as well. So I'm not sure if you can see these, but from the Kalahari Desert through to the islands of the Pacific, through to the Arctic Circle, the plains of North America, the tropical rainforests of South America, we successfully moved into and colonized and inhabit these diverse environments. And as Mark said, there are some genetic adaptations to these, but I would argue that the reason why we as a species managed to do this is more because of our cultural adaptation. Some of the things that you can see in these pictures here, things like bows and arrows, things like streamlined canoes, things like harpoons and thick clothing, things like bows and arrows again. So these are the technological traits, the cultural traits that we have that allow us to live in these different environments. And we can kind of see these as cultural adaptations, as Mark was saying. Cultural adaptations akin to genetic adaptations. So where other species might genetically evolve, say, claws or teeth, we have cultural adaptations of bows and arrows or harpoons or spears. Other species have genetic adaptations for swimming, like streamlined body shapes of fish, whereas we have cultural adaptations like canoes. We have these cultural adaptations that allow us to adapt to different environments much more rapidly than other species who have to rely on genetic adaptation. And this cultural adaptation has continued through to the present day. So if you think of things like aeroplanes and space shuttles and computers and cameras, these, again, are cultural adaptations akin to genetic adaptations. So we have aeroplanes where other species genetically evolve wings. We have cameras to supplement our genetically adapted eyes, for example. So I think, as Mark was saying, this ability to culturally adapt to novel environments is a big piece of why humans have been so successful as a species. And it's a very interesting thing about our species. Another interesting thing, if we move down to the individual level, came out of lots of studies, but this is a nice study by Esther Herman and Mike Tomasello and various people from the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, and they did a nice illustrative study comparing the cognitive abilities, intelligence of 2.5-year-old children of adult chimpanzees and adult orangutans. And some of the tests were tests of physical understanding, so things like understanding number and quantity and laws of physics, and some of the tests were social tests of social intelligence, like imitation, like theory of mind, like communication. And they found, quite interestingly, that there were no significant differences between the species on the tests of physical intelligence, whereas even at 2.5 years old, the kids were significantly outperforming the adult chimps and the adult orangutans, who obviously are our closest genetic relative species. And we can look in a bit more detail at those results. So the top three here are the physical tests, the understanding of quantity, of space, of causality, no real differences there. Down here we have a slight advantage for the kids on theory of mind and communication, but off the scale really is this bottom left panel, which is social learning. Kids are just compulsively driven to copy whatever adults are doing, but whatever other individuals are doing. They're kind of compulsive social learners, compulsive imitators. Chimpanzees and orangutans and other great ape species, they can imitate, obviously, and they can engage in social learning, but kids seem to be compulsively driven to copy what other individuals are doing. And I think we can make a nice link between these two interesting things about our species, the individual level on the left, tendency, compulsion to copy other individuals, and these broad macro-level cultural adaptations. So all of these things on the right here, on the right, things like canoes and bows and arrows and harpoons and everything, we learn those from other individuals in our societies. We learn, hunter-gatherers learn how to make bows and arrows, etc., from other individuals through social learning. These are not genetic adaptations, they're underpinned by social learning. So in some sense, the social learning at the individual level, high-fidelity, compulsive social learning, underpins these broad cultural adaptations that have been responsible for our species' success. But that's a bit kind of hand-wavy. We've got interesting experiments, and we've got broad patterns in the archaeological and ethnographic record, but we want to kind of ask, well, how do we make this link between the micro and the macro level formal? So as Natalie said at the beginning, quite a lot of people have been working over the last few years developing this theory of cultural evolution to make that micro-macro link, the link between individual level psychological cognitive abilities and this broad macro level patterns of cultural diversity and cultural change in the archaeological and the ethnographic record. And this is not a new idea by any means. So as I'm sure many of you know, Darwin himself talked about, just after he came up with his theory of biological evolution applied to species, he almost immediately applied it to a cultural trait, in this case to languages. So he wrote The Formation of Different Languages and of Distinct Species, and the proofs that both have been developed through a gradual process are curiously parallel. People like Mark Pagel have done fantastic work in recent years constructing phylogenies of different human languages using phylogenetic methods, the same kind that you can use to reconstruct the history of species. But interestingly, around the same time, people were also talking about the evolution of technology. So this is the wonderfully named Lieutenant General Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers, who around the same time started applying evolutionary concepts to changes in technology. So if anyone's been to the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, you will have seen some of these where he catalogued different technological traits and argued that they diversify according to evolutionary principles. So you start off with a stick, and different lineages become harpoons and shields and spears and boomerangs. So lots of these Pacific technologies here. So he was taking Darwin's evolutionary theory and applying it to technology. So we can ask, what is exactly is Darwinian about culture? So there's lots of debates about what exactly should a theory of cultural evolution be. What does it mean to say that cultural change is Darwinian? In my view, we can take three basic principles that Darwin laid out in The Origin of Species, applied to species, and we can apply those to cultural change quite easily. A good empirical case can be made that these three are present in cultural change. So we've got variation, so variation within a population of entities, some kind of what Darwin called a struggle for existence, what we might call now differential fitness. Not all variants are equally likely to survive and persist through time, and some kind of inheritance or transmission. So in the cultural case, it would be this social learning, high-fidelity social learning. So just to illustrate it with some of Pitt Rivers artifacts, we might have variation in different technological traits. They get copied in subsequent generations. Some kinds of traits are more likely to be copied than others for various reasons that I'll go into in a moment. And over time, we get changes in the frequencies of a particular trait, and variation within the population of traits, cultural traits, changes, and over multiple generations, and multiple lineages, we get this diversification out to explain this cultural adaptation. But another almost just as crucial point is that this theory is mechanism neutral. So in terms of the details of where the variation comes from, why there's differential fitness, how the inheritance transmission works, that can be very different between the cultural and the genetic case. So for example, in the cultural case, variation may well be non-random, may be guided by individuals, in contrast to random genetic mutation. We know that cultural transmission is most likely to be non-particulate and non-Mendelian. It can work in very different ways. And I would argue that as long as we have these three components, it's an empirical question exactly how they work. But if there are differences between the genetic and the cultural case, that doesn't invalidate a Darwinian theory of cultural change. So just to expand that a little bit maybe, so in evolutionary biology, what biologists do is explain patterns of biological genetic diversity, like variation in finches' beaks, or weird things like peacocks' tails and antlers. They explain those macroevolutionary patterns of adaptive radiation adaptation in terms of microevolutionary processes that biologists have worked out over the last 150 years, things like directional selection, sexual selection, drift, migration, mutation, recombination, and so on. So when we turn to cultural evolution, we want to explain these broad patterns of cultural diversity in the ethnographic and the archaeological record. We want to ask, well, what are the equivalent processes? They may resemble the equivalent genetic processes, microevolutionary processes, or they may be entirely different. And over the last few years, scholars in cultural evolution have been trying to fill in this micro-level gap based on empirical evidence from psychology, from sociology, from anthropology. This is one particular scheme of how to fill in those red question marks here. It came from a paper by Henrich and McElreath, building on work by Boyd and Richardson. So they argue that these red question marks are essentially psychological biases in social learning, and we can divide these into different categories. So they have what they call content biases, so some ideas are intrinsically more likely to be copied and persist over time than other kinds of ideas or skills or knowledge. And they contrast these with context biases, for example, model-based biases. So you copy something that's a particularly prestigious or successful or similar person to you is doing, irrespective of the actual content of the trait that you're copying, or frequency-dependent biases, where you copy whatever's the most common trait in your population or the rarest thing that everybody else is doing, again, irrespective of the content. So it's getting into the psychological details of who's copying what from whom. And as you can see, there's been quite a bit of progress in the field. So this is another paper from a few years later by Luke Randell and Kevin Leyland and that lab in St Andrews, where they've, as you can see, expanded all of these different biases quite a bit. You probably can't see from the back, so I won't go into them, but they divide out model-based biases into 8 or 9 different categories and add different kinds of biases. And these are all kind of based on empirical research from psychology. So we've got a bit of a step further here, I think, where we've started to fill in just generic social learning with all of these specific empirically validated biases in terms of who's copying what from whom and how people acquire traits at the individual level. And again, we want to try and use that to explain population-level patterns in the ethnographic and archaeological record. But I'm still going to put a question mark because there's still a bit of a leap that we need to make between the micro and the macro level. And I think it's quite rare in the literature to find a specific link between the individual level, who's copying what from whom, and specific patterns of cultural diversity, in large part because of the fragmentation of the social scientists. We've got psychologists on the left, and we've got anthropologists and archaeologists and sociologists on the right. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about a nice example where, I think one of the best examples where scholars have actually tried to do that, tried to link specific individual level social learning biases, learning strategies to a specific pattern of cultural empirical pattern of cultural diversity. And the example concerns this from the very first slide from particular kind of traits, so bows and arrows, projectile points from North America. and specifically projectile points or arrowheads from a particular region of North America called the Great Basin in the southwestern United States, and we're interested here in a period around AD 300 to 600. As you can see, we've got some actual artifacts here that archaeologists have uncovered from this particular time period. And the interesting thing here is that we've got quite a lot of cultural diversity. So you can see that these projectile points that were used by hunter-gatherers to kill things like bison down in the bottom left vary in quite a lot of dimensions. So they vary in the height, the width, the thickness, the color, which is a function of the material. They vary in the shape at the base, which was used to attach the arrowhead to the shaft. So there's quite a lot of variation in these projectile points that archaeologists have documented. But this variation isn't random. It's systematic in a way that two archaeologists, Bob Bettinger and Elmer Yerkens, documented a few years back, and they observed that arrowheads from two sites in particular show different amounts of within-region diversity in their design. So in one site in California, they found that there was quite a lot of variation in the arrowheads. There were no systematic links between the different dimensions of the traits of the arrowhead. So an arrowhead that was long was just as likely to be thick as it was to be thin. So there was no correlation between the different dimensions of the arrowheads on the left there, whereas in another site from around the same time period, same raw materials, same ecology, they found, in Nevada, they found a very different pattern. They found very little variation and quite uniform design. So a small number of uniform types, if you like, where if an arrowhead was long, then it was significantly more likely to be thin rather than thick, for example. So there were tight correlations between the different attributes of the arrowheads in Nevada. And these are the actual correlations here. To put numbers on it, you can see the red correlations between the different dimensions in Nevada were always much higher than the correlations in California. So that's the pattern of cultural diversity that Bettinger and Yerkens came up with, and they made this, the reason I like this study is because they made this link between the individual level learning biases and this pattern of variation. So they argued that this particular pattern, they ruled out ecological differences. They explained it in terms of these different social learning biases. So they argue that in Nevada, the reason you got this low variation, these small number of uniform types, is because arrowhead design spread via one of those model-based biases, via success bias. So if you imagine in your group there's one particularly good arrowhead maker and hunter, the kind of David Beckham of arrowhead makers in your particular group, and they're obviously successful, and you're engaging in a kind of success bias, you're copying the traits of the most successful person. Pretty soon everybody in the group will have the same arrowhead design. If that happens in different groups and different successful individuals are using different arrowhead designs, then you get these uniform types. Whereas in California, they argued that arrowhead design spread via what Boyd and Richardson, other researchers have called guided variation. This is where you might start off with copying the arrowhead design of a particular person, maybe a successful person, so you use that as a template, but then there's a huge dollop of individual learning, of individual experimentation as everybody plays around with their arrowhead design, and gradually variation builds up within the group and correlations between the attributes drop. So what Bettinger and Yerkens did here was to provide a hypothesis linking individual level copying rules, so success bias versus guided variation, to these observed patterns of archaeological variation. So linking the psychological learning biases at the top here to broad patterns of cultural diversity at the bottom, making this micro-evolutionary, microcultural evolutionary to macrocultural evolutionary link. So I think that's a nice example of an attempt to link the micro and the macro. I'm still going to put a question mark here because, barring the invention of a time machine, we can't actually go back and observe prehistoric hunters copying the most successful person in the group. And there's also other questions, for example, that it leaves outstanding. For example, why were Californians engaging in guided variation and Nevadans engaging in success bias in the first place? So it still leaves quite a few questions open. So this is where the experiments come in. So myself and another archaeologist, Mike O'Brien, a few years back, we set out to conduct experimental tests of Bettinger and Erkin's particular hypothesis. So we wanted to ask, do these proposed learning biases actually generate the predicted arrowhead correlations? So we wanted to recreate it in the lab where we actually know what people are doing, who's copying what from whom, and just as importantly, under what conditions do we see this pattern emerging in the lab that we can then verify with archaeological data. So we had lots of groups of participants did this in groups of 6, and they designed virtual arrowheads. Essentially made them play a computer game where they could enter the different attributes that archaeologists were measuring in the actual Great Basin data set, so things like height, width, and thickness, continuous variables. They could choose different shapes, choose different kind of colors, kind of trying to recreate the kind of variation that we see in the actual archaeological record. And just a quick note on fitness assumptions. So one of the advantages of experiments really is that it forces us to be explicit about the assumptions in hypotheses. And one of the problems we immediately came up with Bettinger and Erkin's hypothesis is, so first of all, we assumed a kind of cultural fitness, so how close the participants' arrowheads were to hidden optimal designs determined their payoff or their hunting success. We had to have some kind of measure of fitness. But the problem that we came up against with Bettinger and Erkin's hypothesis is that if we assume just a single optimal arrowhead design, one best possible arrowhead design in the environment, then individual learners will all converge on this design, reducing diversity. So it would be just functionally equivalent to everybody copying the most successful David Beckham-like arrowhead maker. And so if we assume that there's just a single best possible arrowhead design, that effectively eliminates any differences between the conditions. So we wanted to play around more explicitly with these some fitness assumptions. So in some of the studies, we assumed instead a multimodal fitness landscape. So the three continuous attributes, height, width, and thickness, we assumed that there were bimodal fitness functions. So for each one of these, there's a global optimum which gave the highest possible contribution from that particular trait, but there was also a local optimum which gave 2/3 the fitness of the global optimum, and the total fitness of the whole arrowhead was the sum of these three fitness functions, which gave a kind of multimodal landscape where the peaks, with different peaks representing different locally optimal arrowhead designs of different heights, so they were different functionality. So the hypothesis now becomes that the reason you see the diversity in the individual learning guided variation condition is that different individuals are exploring the landscape in different ways and converging on different peaks in the landscape. So that's a way of maintaining diversity in the group. And secondary hypothesis is that success bias social learners in this situation, when they're copying more successful people, they're copying people who found a higher peak in the landscape by definition because they're more successful, and so that would reduce variation as they're all jumping onto the higher peak. So we would see this in terms of jumps in fitness if we track fitness or payoff over time. So this is a kind of the process of designing experiments and models as well. We model it, kind of forces us to be explicit about these kinds of assumptions in a way that Bettinger and Erkin's weren't with their original hypothesis. So we designed it where we had people copying an initial arrowhead, and then they went through a series of individual learning trials where they had to improve their arrowhead over successive hunts. And then a final period of success bias social learning at the end, where they could copy other individuals in the group and they could see their success. And the prediction, just to remind you, is that the green bits, the individual learning, should result in low correlations between the attributes, and at the very end, the success bias, we should see an increase in correlations between the attributes. This is the game that we got people to play. This is an individual learning trial with no social information. They couldn't see anybody else's arrowhead. People just had to change the values at the top of the arrowhead and use individual trial and error to explore the landscape and try to improve their score over time. So they could change the continuous variables there, such as height and width, as well as the fitness one, and they get a payoff that was calculated from the fitness functions. So calories out of 1,000 or bits of bison, we showed them as well. So that was an individual learning hunt. And then for the social learning hunt, we showed them, you can see at the box on the left there, they could see their other fellow hunters in the group's scores, and they could choose, I'm sure you can see it, but it's got their scores next to everybody's names, and they could choose to copy the most successful person or not copy the most successful person if they wished, and it showed the most successful person's values in red next to their own, and they could again choose to copy those values. This person's copying, I think, the most successful person almost exactly, and abandoning their own arrowhead, and they've done quite well out of that. So again, that was the final ones where people could copy successful individuals. So what did we find? So at the top is the actual correlations. At the bottom here we can see the experimental correlations, and you can see we recreated the pattern quite well. So for the green guided variation conditions, all of those correlations, almost all of those correlations are much lower than the success bias correlations, which are much higher. So we recreated the patterns of correlations that Bettinger and Erkens observed in their actual Great Basin data. So we can be more confident in Bettinger and Erkens' hypothesis that the differences, the regional differences between the different areas in the Great Basin were due to different kinds of learning strategies. And another advantage of experiments, I guess, is that we can track fitness or payoff over time. So we wanted to test that idea that the success bias social learning is adaptive because people can jump to higher peaks in the landscape, and we observed that as well. So those last 5 hunts there, the blue line, participants who could copy more successful people, and they significantly outperformed the black line, which is individual controls who couldn't copy anybody else at any time. And just to verify that it's the landscape that's driving this, again, we can play around with it. So we changed the environment to a unimodal landscape with just a single best possible arrowhead design. Here, individual learners do just as well as the social learners. So all the individual learners just easily converged on the peak, the single peak, and that reduced diversity as well. So, so the first conclusion from this is that the experiment suggests that this Great Basin projectile point variation, the cultural diversity, may indeed have been generated by these differences in biased learning, success bias versus guided variation, but only in a multimodal fitness landscape. And there's actually nice evidence for this. So experimental archaeologists have fired projectile points into carcasses and found interesting kind of functional trade-offs between, say, length and fitness of arrowhead design. So thin, narrow points have greater penetrating power, but wide, thick points create a larger wound that bleeds more easily. These experiments are quite gruesome, but they determine these different kind of what you might see as different peaks in a landscape, or it might be to do with prey species, so there might be a rabbit peak or a bison peak. Justifying that assumption, and again validating Bettinger and Erkens' hypothesis. Another interesting second conclusion is that one of the traits, I didn't mention, but one of the traits, color of the arrowhead, was completely neutral, had no effect whatsoever on the effectiveness, on the score that participants received, on the effectiveness of the arrowhead design, but it was copied just as faithfully as all of the other functional traits, the height, the width, the thickness, the shape. And so we suggest this might be a nice case of cultural hitchhiking, a neutral trait hitchhiking on the back of functional traits. And we might be able to see this generally in various traits, even in contemporary society, where people copy the hairstyle of David Beckham, which almost certainly had nothing to do with David Beckham's footballing success, or advertisers pay high prestigious or successful people like David Beckham a lot of money to drink their cola or use their particular razors in the hope that people will engage in this success bias, even though, again, drinking Pepsi probably had nothing to do with, almost certainly had nothing to do with David Beckham becoming a good footballer. My favorite, Ronaldinho and photocopiers. Again, there's no rational link between Ronaldinho and photocopiers, but people seem to be copying things because they're associated with high success, high prestige models. And maybe more seriously, things like copycat suicide or smoking might be more maladaptive traits that are hitchhiking on the back of markers of success that we might think of. And finally, we can ask this more origin question. So why do the different regions differ in their kind of social learning strategies in the first place? Why does California have more guided variation? Why does Nevada have more success bias? Well, a couple of reasons that came out of the experiments. One might be the cost of individual learning. So in one version of the study, we added a cost, so participants had to pay 200 calories every time they wanted to change their arrowhead, so imposing a cost on experimentation. So this reduced exploration of the landscape, the adaptive landscape, and made success-biased social learning even more adaptive as everybody clambered to the even fewer numbers of people who found the highest fitness peak in the landscape, and so there was an even bigger advantage of social learning. So we suggest maybe something about the Nevadan environment may have been more costly, so the Nevadan environment may have been harsher in some respects, making social learning more appealing there. And another tweak that we did was introducing informational access costs. So if you think about contemporary society, knowledge doesn't come for free, so we might pay lawyers, essentially when we're hiring a lawyer, essentially paying to access their legal knowledge, and different lawyers might have different kind of access costs, different prices on their knowledge. So the guy on the left is probably more expensive because of his greater legal knowledge than whoever's running the drive-through lawyer scheme on the right there. So different individuals can set different prices effectively on their knowledge, and we implemented this in the experiment where we allowed participants to set prices for their arrowhead designs that other individuals had to copy, had to pay in order to copy their arrowhead designs. This is a kind of dummy run where you can see added the prices in the box on the left, and then it tells you how many people copied you and how much you made from selling your information effectively. And we found, quite interestingly, that this effectively blocked all social learning in the setup that we had here. So the first 2 seasons, you can see there, this is the frequency of copying, percentage of participants who copied. Those first 2 seasons, very high levels of copying. That 3rd season where we introduced the access costs, frequencies of copying dropped quite dramatically. And the black bar is copying the successful person, and that reduced even more dramatically. So people were not copying anymore, and they were copying less, and they were hardly ever copying the most successful person. This reduced any kind of advantage or difference between the individual learning conditions and the social learning conditions, because effectively no one was copying. And this was because the most successful participants were setting ridiculously high access costs that nobody could possibly afford. So 2,500, 3,000 calories costs on their arrowhead design, and nobody was willing to buy this information. It may have been an artifice of the setup that we had here, which was a rather competitive situation, but it suggests that people are not intrinsically motivated to share their information at least not in all cases. So again, final conclusion. Differences in learning strategies may be caused by this difference in cost of learning, which came out of the experiments. So a harsher environment in Nevada, which made individual learning more costly, but it also may be differences in informational access costs. So there may have been higher access costs for whatever reason in California, which prevented efficient social learning. And we know from the ethnographic record, contemporary ethnography, that different societies have different kinds of access costs. So the Irian Jaya adze makers have very tight prescriptive apprenticeship systems where they protect their knowledge, and only certain people can acquire adze making skills, adze making knowledge, whereas other societies like the Arca in the Congo are much more egalitarian and share knowledge much more readily. So it's interesting, it kind of touches on what Mark was saying as well, interesting the cooperative motivations between different societies in terms of sharing knowledge. Okay, so just to finish up, general conclusions, this cultural adaptation, I think, is one of the main reasons why our species has been so successful through evolutionary history, and this is underpinned by our capacity for social learning, but I think we need to link specific social learning biases to real-world patterns of cultural diversity in the way that biologists link specific micro-evolutionary processes like different kinds of selection and drift and mutation to patterns of biological adaptation. We need to do the same in the social sciences and get over this kind of disciplinary fragmentation and start integrating psychological research with archaeological and anthropological research. And I think experiments offer quite a powerful tool for doing this, used in conjunction with real-world data, validated at every step with the actual empirical record. So I'll just thank various funders and thank you for your attention.